In 1938, National Periodic was looking for a headline character for something called a comic book, and they ended up getting this for I think $130 off of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. The character was called Superman. Superman was influenced by the pulps like Doc Savage, radio shows like The Shadow, and a little thing that a guy named Mr. Gaines had taken a bunch of Funny Animal comic strips and folded them into what became a comic book. Action number 1 was the debut of Superman. Thing took off. A year later we had Batman. A year later after that we had Captain America. Comic books had hit the mainstream thanks to an evil man called Hitler. Right on the front cover of Captain America, first issue out, he's knocking the crap out of Hitler. Soon there came many other superheroes during this time. Captain Marvel, the great Shazam, was selling close to or over 2 million copies. Comic books were outselling, magazines like Time and Newsweek. Depending on what kind of history books you get into, you find out that when soldiers were getting their rations, like I said, it depends on the history book. Not only did they get their food, but they got a cigarette, a condom, and a comic book. The war effort was hitting. Comic books were selling in the millions every month. And even in the comic books, they were telling you to donate things like rubber and metal for the war cause and paper. People were handing over the actual comic books they were reading in. And for the war effort, the war ended. And much like the Minutemen and the Watchmen, superheroes in comics appeared to be a fad. Or so they thought. Superheroes started declining. The only 3 that really survived were the Trinity: Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And as things progressed, we started getting Funny Animals and sci-fi comic books and Archie comics. The character of Archie and Jughead and all them started taking off. In 1946 and 47, crime comics started taking off. A year later, 48, horror comics really started taking off. EC Comics, became a real leader in a lot of these things. Romance comics came in the 50s, and this whole time, comic books were kind of considered to be for kids as time went by, even though it was soldiers and grown-ups buying them and everything. Some stories were much less sophisticated than others. Children were reading these books and rolling them up, putting them in their back pockets. And according to comic lore, I don't know if it was a horror comic or what it was called a headlight comic, where they would have women with huge breasts, such as Phantom Lady, on the covers of their comics. But a little kid was with his friends at a little outside dinner party, and a mom picked up the comics and saw the sex and the violence and everything. And supposedly this was a senator's wife who took it straight to her senator husband, who was having this luncheon, this outside dinner party or whatever it was, and they started to form a committee that would study the effects of comic books on adolescents. This was followed by a article in Reader's Digest by a man named Frederick Wortham. And it started out, he published a article in Reader's Digest about how comic books were degrading and diminishing and just warping the kids of their American values. This was the beginning of a witch hunt. Led up to a book called Seduction of the Innocent, where it looked at Batman and Robin being a bad influence on kids because it was a gay relationship. Unrealistic expectations out there because Superman could fly. The horror comics with the decapitated ladies' heads on the covers and the violence. Women as torture. Damsels in distress were now just being tortured. It about wiped out the industry. People were running scared. The Comics Code Authority was brought in that would be a way of censoring comics if they were going to survive. EC Comics pretty much quit publishing comic books and had gone on with their horror magazine Mad. And slowly but surely the Silver Age was able to start. Comics did survive this time. But now it had gotten worse. People who had worked in the comics even in the 40s would lie about what they did for a living because it was just awful to have anything to do with the occupation of being in comics. Not a lot of respect, even though they helped the war effort. There's a big Senate hearing that were going after comic books and comic book publishers, a witch hunt. And the Flash came in, and arguably he started the Silver Age. This led up to great sales over many months, and the two publishers of what was going to be DC and what would turn into Marvel were having a golf game, and thanks to the Flash, they were starting to bring back heroes and had done the Justice League, and it was this selling like you wouldn't believe. So the man said you need to get a team book up, which led to the Fantastic Four. And we know about the Silver Age of Marvel, man, kind of a golden age. Now, comics were still considered for kids. It was just not a respectable occupation to be in. And college kids picked up on it. It turned into counterculture. One example of this counterculture was the Hulk. The Comics Code Authority did not allow the U.S. government in any way, shape, or form to be presented as a villain, yet we had the Hulk fighting the Army because the Army was chasing him. They snuck it in there, intentional or unintentional. Then we also had Spider-Man. You know, Peter Parker was one of us who got powers. His book really stood out. We know where that went. Time went on, and we led up to cartoons and a resurgence of comics, and DC Comics controlled distributing rights through a company which really limited Marvel with the number of books they could put out. That's why they had Strange Tales, which had 2 features in them. And during this time, we had people who were fans of comics while they were growing up. The first generation of people who had grown up reading comics and had gone around their neighborhoods in New York and stuff, collecting Golden Age comics, you know, just searching for them. Not for value, but for love of the comics. Roy Thomas, Len Wein, and Marv Wolfman. And Len Wein is the one to really have that stand out, his name stand out in this. And people were like, why do you want to do comics? Steve Englehart was another one. And they all came in and they started working, and they had a joy of comics. They had no shame working in comics, you know, from what I can tell. But still there was this lack of respectability for comics. There was still this comics are for kids. So we go through the Bronze Age and we come up until the early 80s, and we have a man named Alan Moore who comes on, and his debut comic in America was Swamp Thing, and they ended up taking off that Comics Code Authority off the cover. He got words like sophisticated horror, and all of a sudden these were stories that weren't quite for kids. People who had grown up reading comics, more or less, a lot of them kind of, you know, closet collectors, if you will. Not all of them, you know. And all of a sudden, it's apparent that there are adults collecting comics. They had grown up collecting comics. And then Charlton Comics from the 60s got bought out by DC due to the company going out of business. Dick Giordano was the editor during that time, and he didn't want to see these characters just disappear. Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, Nightshade, The Question, Mr. A, all great characters. Thunderbolt, Judo Master. He bought them up and he presented them to Alan Moore. Do something with this. And right there was history in the making, because when he got the presentation that Alan Moore had gotten, he couldn't let him do it. He said these characters are they're unusable after what he did. He had written a masterpiece. So he told him, make your own characters. So Moore and Gibbons got on there, and they came up with 6 issues of plot. And DC wanted 12, from my understanding. We're going to give him 12. So we had 6 issues of plot, and that would be issues 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 ended up being characterization. You get the idea. I probably messed up the numbers there. But anyway, that was the story. And oh my, what did we get? So Alan Moore ended up writing, with Dave Gibbons being equal partner in this, in my opinion, with what how they set up this whole comic, to be the first comic to actually give credibility to the art form of comic books. From the get-go, comic books were disrespected, and it's just something, if you worked in them, you hit it. Lin Wynn ended up being the editor of this. And Lin Wynn was really upset with Alan Moore because he got this basically from a plot from an Outer Limits TV show, one of the episodes in there. I think it was called Architects of Fear. So with Alan Moore having all this heat on him, he was hot, man. He had done Superman number 11 for The Man Who Had Tomorrow. He had done his Swamp Thing. He'd done a DC Comics Present number 85, Superman and the Swamp Thing. The man was just on fire. Miracle Man, I think, was kind of churning there. And hitting direct to market was this, Watchmen number 1. And that's what we're going to be reviewing today. Now, some of the things I want to get out there before I crack this open, because I'm not opening these. Okay? This is not me showing off or anything, but 6 of these comics have never been opened. These are my mint set. And what we have here is Ghost Critic has come around and has taken the most heralded, and it was just, I could kick myself in the butt for not thinking of it, because what he has done is just amazing. He has asked 11 of us to come in and review one comic at a time. And that is actually more difficult than you think, because the magic of what Alan Moore has done is that he took everything you could just do in comics that you can't do in a novel, you can't do on TV, you can't do in movies, and they all go together. You flip back and forth. You're not dragged through the story like in a movie. You're not reading a lot of descriptive, a very descriptive format that makes things pop out like in a novel. It's very subtle, and it's its own little world, and this is designed to sit down by the fire with a glass of wine and to go back and forth, because everything references everything else. Only in a comic can you do that. So I get to do number 1, and hopefully you guys will kick in there, make a playlist, and watch over and over as we go through each issue of The Watchmen. And I'm very excited and very honored to be a part of this. So if you've hung in there, we're going to get started. And this is what to come. And I get to jump in there and finish this off with number 12. I get to bookend it. Alright. Now, I'm not going to crack this open, so we'll be using the trade that I've had since 1988. And the way I required this was very seedy. I ended up, I was a teenager, and I had a few comic books to trade off, and in a grocery parking lot, you know, kind of in the dark at dusk there under a street lamp, I traded some comics and got this. And oh my God, I was way too young to be reading this. Okay. Rorschach's Journal, October 13th, 1985, 11:30 p.m. On Friday night, a comedian died in New York. Someone threw him out of a window, and when he hit the sidewalk, his head was driven up into his stomach. Nobody cares. Nobody cares but me. Are they right? Is it futile? Soon there will be war. Billions will burn. Millions will perish in sickness and misery. Why does one death matter against so many? Because there is good and there is evil. And evil must be punished even in the face of Armageddon. I shall not compromise in this. But there are so many deserving of retribution, and there is so little time. We start out with the cover. And this is right away where you realize that this is extremely different, because the cover is actually the splash page. Leads to the first page. And as you can see by the structure of this and the way things are backing off, the smiley face with the blood stain becomes a recurring symbol in this, a recurring image. You can flip back and forth through this. We have the death of the comedian. That is his blood being washed down. That is his button that he wore with his costume. And as you can see, some things right away that are also different is that they used what's called a secondary palette, is what I understand. They took instead of using primary colors in this comic book, they used the secondary colors. That's your oranges, your purples, and shades of brown and whatnot. It's just it makes a very uncomfortable and almost ugly palette. This is set in the real world. That's why there aren't a bunch of big flashy splash pages. In the real world, if people were to wear costumes, they would not be sitting there in poses. They would not be actually forming a team to a certain extent. The biggest misconception that I want to point out there, and this is mostly probably thanks to the movie, is that the Watchmen was never a group. The word Watchman is actually a slanderous term thrown at the vigilantes who watches the Watchmen in the 70s. They were never actually a group, but they interacted. So as we start out, those of you there will be spoilers in this, is that we have the mood getting set. We have Rorschach's journal getting into this. We're backing up from, we're zooming out from our front cover up and up and up into the detectives there, who are investigating and trying to put things together about how did this guy get killed? How did he get thrown out of a window? Was it one guy on drugs? Was it two attackers? And why would they do it? They find pictures of him with Gerald Ford. And the great thing is that it's most of this is a 9-panel layout. And not these 2 pages in particular, but throughout the book we get a whole lot more story. Alan Moore brings in metaphors and foreshadowing. And right away we're hooked. It's a murder mystery, and we get the feeling that they're hinting at things like could it be the groups of the knot tops? Could it be the KT-28s on lewds and stuff like that? And they just kind of give you a cast of characters, they're beginning to build up who could have been the murderer. It's a classic murder mystery. And then right away we start seeing the shadow of Manhattan fall over this book. This is the real world, yet if you look closely you start seeing things aren't quite what they are. This was pretty much the real world up into the 60s. And not to get ahead of myself, but you start seeing electric cars and you start seeing fashions. And you start getting mood set with this man down here walking back and forth. The end is near. Foreshadowing. We're on the brink of war. Why? What was the difference? Why would these people put on costumes and then be able to affect this world? And then we get into our 9-panel layout. We're starting to slowly get introduced to the first of our cast of characters that the police were hoping would not get in there. At midnight, all the agents. We're introduced to Rorschach, and he comes in, and right away he's a detective. He's coming in to do the job right. He's finding things that the police missed. He goes over to a wardrobe, and he instantly notices that it is longer on the outside than the inside, and he uses a little technique. And then you start looking closer, and you see that his mask is actually a Rorschach block that changes with this panel to panel. And then when you look at his costume, you immediately get the idea that this man really is psychotic. His costume is unbuttoned, this shelved. It kind of reflects his mental state. And what did we discover? This was to not just have been a normal murder, because this was the comedian. And then you start seeing this world keep getting built. This is just introduction. You see the Minutemen. And as we go through, we start seeing, we get introduced to Nighthawk and Dan Dryberg, and we start learning the history of the Keene Act, putting these guys out in '77. And immediately you begin to realize that we're in a world that the story began long ago, and we're discovering it for the first time through our own eyes. Rorschach is the person that is the narrator to a certain extent, but as we travel through this world, we really see that we pick up on the history. We see how people are starting to interact. We're seeing people. These people are flawed, they're fat and out of weight. They've been retired since 1977. We know what year it is thanks to Rorschach's journal. We immediately start getting to know Rorschach, and we start seeing the effect that if someone really became a superhero, what would it have on? Rorschach's more or less a scavenger. He's sitting there eating beans and stuff from Dan Dryberg. He's broke into the house. He's fine. He has weird nights. He's unclean. They talk about the smell of him. And he's really cynical and paranoid of what people are saying about him because he's refused to compromise. He's refused to be outlawed. And he's informing him that the comedian has died tonight. So as Rorschach takes us through there, we start getting an idea of how these people are, Dan Dryberg, middle-aged, fat, and the shadow of the life that he had. He needs the costume. You can tell something had happened. And immediately we're starting to get into a deconstruction of superheroes. Why would people put on costumes? Why would they not quit? Who are these people if they really did this? So immediately we start seeing the tactics. Rorschach's idea of finding out who killed the comedian is to hit the bars. He walks in, he informs everybody he wants information. He starts breaking fingers. And he's informed, I just broke this man's pinky finger. Who killed the comedian? The man is squirming in pain. The vile scum and lowlifes are all like begging him to quit because they don't know anything. So Rorschach begins to think this is a mass killing. Now, that's just the whole thing. Rorschach, you're immediately coming off that this guy just isn't right. He's psychotic. I can't say it enough. And paranoid. Is there a mass killer? Or is he just being paranoid? And that's what everybody's wondering. So he goes and he meets Adrian Veidt, which is actually the exact opposite of him. Veidt, you find out, gave up his... Adrian Veidt is a very interesting character to a certain extent because he's the smartest man on earth. He has built a fortune on his image because he retired and revealed his secret identity in 1975. And, you can kind of tell that Rorschach just loathes him. And these are two people the exact opposite, Rorschach is sort of, you can just kind of tell that he's just unstable and, he's really never quit being a superhero. And you start getting the idea that, whoever his secret identity is, that person doesn't exist. He is Rorschach. That is his face. And we get in there, and right here's a spoiler. This is something I really want to get into this review here, is that as Rorschach leaves through a window, we sit there and we see Adrian Veidt looking down on him. And he says, "Sure, have a nice day." Now, if you watch these reviews to all the way to where you find out who killed the comedian, maybe a little spoiler there, that was right in your face the whole time the first time you read it. It's almost like they were waving the flag saying, "Gotcha." So all of a sudden Rorschach goes through here and he's trying to get into a test facility, and we start seeing what the techniques in the real world would be on what they picked up on, how they could sneak around. And again we start getting more of this history. He starts going over how Veidt gave him a bad taste in his mouth, how he's possibly homosexual. He calls Dryberg a bad, flabby failure who sits whimpering in his basement. Why are so few of us left active, healthy, and without personality disorders? The first night owl runs an antique shop, an auto repair shop. The first silk spectre is a bloated, aging whore dying in a California rest resort. Captain Metropolis was decapitated in a car crash in '74. Mothman's in an asylum in Maine. And he goes on, and you're just sort of like, wow. We have characters, when you were reading comic books at the time, you didn't get any of this. What was the effect that this lifestyle would have on people? And basically he goes in there and we are cast into meeting Dr. Manhattan, the first actual superhero. And he's nude. There's no costume. And this guy's bigger than life. So much is told in that panel after you get off the shock of seeing, a 30-foot naked man. And you see that he's living with the Silk Spectre and she loathes him. And automatically, he teleports Rorschach out when he starts upsetting Silk Spectre. He calls her Sally Jupiter, and she informs him of her name is Jespieks or something like that. It's a Polish name. I apologize for not remembering how to say it correctly. I'm on camera. Immediately we start getting into more or less, politics and racial slurs and really adult stuff at the time that you just did not hear. She changed her name. Her mother changed her name due to not want to be affiliated as a Polak for being Polish, due to racism back in the 40s and 50s. Because I'm getting ahead of myself. So he immediately teleports Rorschach out, and he just keeps going. And we finally see that Silk Spectre and Dan Dryberg go out for a dinner, and we see more of the shadow that Dr. Manhattan has cast on this world. We have gay couples out eating dinner openly. We have people ordering four-legged chickens, I believe, and they start reminiscing. And the first thing I sort of picked up when I was reading this is they were wondering, why did we put on the costumes, why we were being so silly, and they were both acting like it's something they hated or they thought was silly. And they talk about Captain Carnage. This man had a thing. It was a sexual. He had some kind of psychosexual disorder where he liked getting beat up. So he would want to get beat up by these costume people, begging them to beat him up, and he was getting off on it. Rorschach, dumps him down an elevator shaft. A little blast of reality there, and they're reminiscing about who could have killed the comedian and stuff. But you can tell they're missing this lifestyle, and that's where we're introduced to our cast of characters, and there's more to come. And if you've got an idea of this world, it is our world. Why would people do this? These people are flawed. These people have opinions. These people are political. And there's a tone of sexual tension going through the book. Nothing that had been seen before. And immediately, what I picked up on as I read later issues, there's a lot of foreshadowing in this. There's a lot of symbolism really kind of getting started up. But Alan Moore and them didn't really have that. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons didn't really pick up on how heavy that was getting at issue 3. And there are no villains in this. You have people running around in costumes, but there's not a lot of villains. That's one of the first things I noticed. We are looking for a masked killer. There's a killer somewhere, yet there's not a lot of costume. We haven't seen any costumes yet, except for Rorschach. Now, the other thing that happened there is that Dick Giordano believed in this story so much they decided to run it without ads. And when they ran it without ads, each book we got excerpts to flesh out this world more. And the original Night Owl wrote a book, I believe came out in the 60s or 70s, called Under the Hood. And Under the Hood means two things. The original Night Owl ended up opening an auto shop, so under the hood of a car. Well, it's also about under the hood. Why did he become Night Owl? And we start learning more about why people do this. Okay? It's just amazing, because now we get to read a book that's in this world. What would people read about? What would a biography be? And it's a beautifully written piece of work. Alan Moore is the man. So I'm going to read you an excerpt here, and we're going to bookend this video. He says, "For me, it all started in 1938, the year when they invented the superhero. I was too old for comic books when the first issue of Action Comics came out, or at least too old to read them in public without souring my promotional chances. But I noticed a lot of the little kids on my beat reading it and couldn't resist asking one of them if I could have a glance through it. I figured if anybody saw me, I could put it all down to keeping a good relationship with the youth of the community. There was a lot of stuff in that first issue. There was detective yarns and stories about magicians whose names I can't remember, but from the moment I set eyes on it, I only had eyes for the Superman story. Here was something that presented the basic morality of the pulps without all the darkness and ambiguity. The atmosphere of the horrific and faintly sinister that hung around the shadow was nowhere to be seen in the bright primary colors of Superman's world, and there was no hint of the repressed sex urge which had sometimes been apparent in the pulps to my discomfort and embarrassment. I've never been entirely sure what Lamont Cranston was up to with Margot Lane, but I bet it was nowhere near as innocent and wholesome as Clark Kent's relationship with his namesake Lois. Of course, all these old characters are gone and forgotten now, but I'm willing to bet that there are at least a few older readers out there who will remember enough to know what I'm talking about. Anyway, suffice it to say that I read the story about 8 times before giving it back to the complaining kids that I snitched it from. So automatically, in a world where superheroes exist, people don't want to read superheroes. Alright. Thank you.